Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. This episode will continue our second golden age of rock series, the era that spans from the mid-1960s through the early 1970s, and it will set its ever-loving gaze on the year 1966. This is the year that the recreational use of LSD among artists, musicians, and others in hip bohemian circles, something that had been going on for several years now, finally starts to show its overt influence on popular music itself, rather than just lyrically, as Bob Dylan had been doing the previous couple of years, I should say. This would have a seismic impact on rock music and popular music as a whole, an effect whose ripples are still being felt today in the 21st century as psychedelic tones and sounds are still being explored in indie rock, hip-hop, R&B and soul, electronica, and even jazz. But at the time, in the mid-1960s, it was an era and a generation-defining development. It was more than a development, more like a movement that opened doors for new and upcoming artists to be as bold and experimental as they wanted to be. It also provided a creative kick in the ass for established artists to not just catch up with the times, but to look inside and challenge themselves with newer and fresher methods of expression. All this said, 1966 was a year that three artists in particular stood out from the rest of the pack, and by some considerable margin: the Beach Boys, Bob Dylan, and the Beatles. Earlier in the decade, Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys' mastermind composer and producer, had created a brand of sublime surf pop by merging rock and roll with doo-wop vocal harmonies. By the middle of the decade, Wilson was creating a new sound of sublime orchestral pop. While his drug use and mental health issues would eventually get the best of him in later years, during this early period in his life, it's difficult to argue that what he crafted in the enduring Immortal Pet Sounds album wasn't psychedelically inspired. Bob Dylan's experimentation with LSD inspired him to take music lyricism to another level of symbolic and expressionistic artistry, while undergoing the then unthinkable act of basically merging the melodic and lyrical sweep of folk music with the visceral power and the cathartic energy of rock and roll. In 1966, he would take this potent combination to its logical conclusion with the epic, surrealist masterpiece Blonde on Blonde. And then, of course, there are the Beatles. Very little can be said about the greatest and most important band of the 20th century that hasn't already been said. Needless to say, the quantum leap they made the previous year in lyrical and musical sophistication with the albums Help and Rubber Soul was outdone by another quantum leap in 1966 with the kaleidoscopic and immensely influential psychedelic pop masterpiece Revolver. We'll also check in on other all-time classic albums that were part of the psychedelic 60s vanguard, as well as individual singles by bands and artists that defined this unbelievably fertile period in rock history in this installment of the Curmudgeon Rock Report, the second golden age of rock, 1966.
So, Arturo, I think you had it about right. This discussion of 1966 really is a discussion or a tale of three albums. Lysergics or not, regardless of the Lysergics, this year is definitely defined by the three albums that we'll talk about. And everything else that follows from it really has its influence, even seeping into the black music a little bit, as we'll talk about.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, this is generally the theme here is psychedelia. And these three albums were very psychedelic in their own way. Like I mentioned earlier, with Dylan, it was in the lyrics. With the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, it was in the overall sound and the feel of the record. I mean, this was really like, this wasn't Brian Wilson's first post-acid album, but it was his first acid album in a lot of ways. And Revolver is like very much the Beatles, almost at their psychedelic peak.
Yeah, almost. But well, it depends. I mean, some people, it's like tomato and tomato between Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's.
Right.
And the sneak peek I think Sgt. Pepper's might show up in the discussion of 1967. I don't know. Maybe.
Do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say that it's possibly a good bet. Now the 16th best album ever made, according to Rolling Stone, after being number one for years and years and years and years.
Right.
So, Hey, go figure. So anyway, how you doing otherwise, bro?
Good, man. Good. I'm looking forward to this, our second Golden Age series we're trudging on. And we're in the meat and potatoes of it.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the meat, the potatoes. This is the corn. This is the gravy. This is all of the trimmings. Speaking of Thanksgiving coming up, we might as well start whetting up people's appetites and make this the soundtrack to your family dinner. Even if you're a middle-aged man, you can still piss off your parents.
Yeah.
So
just play songs inspired by drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. Where people still piss off their parents and don't actually go to the same concerts as them, don't you?
Gee, where is that?
That would be a place known as the parallel universe. Here, over in this side of the space-time continuum, rock and roll is still dangerous. It still is the thing that is on the cultural zeitgeist. It's the thing that still separates us from our earlier generations. None of this moms, grandmas, and daughters going to Taylor Swift concerts. We are not multi-generational over here. We are here, we are present, and we are all about what's immediate. And basically a shorthand way of saying that we cover albums from artists who we think are really neato and that you should know about. And we're being your fact-checking cuz here. And so, Arturo, who are you covering on this episode's version of the Parallel Universe?
Say She is the name of the band, and their new album, their second album, called Silver. Now, Say She are a 7-piece band fronted by a female trio from Brooklyn, New York, that basically takes mid to late 1970s R&B, soul, and disco, and they give them a modernist indie boost. Well, one of them is from New York. The other two are from Washington, D.C. and London, England. Anyway, their debut album from last year, Prism, frankly wasn't very good. It was way too soft, poppy, and mellow, and drenched in vocal harmonies by a group of women who honestly weren't quite good enough singers yet. It sounded exactly like what it was. An album made by a group of trust-funded rich girls living in a Brooklyn loft who are too satisfied with their Gen Z wonderfulness. Nice. However, their new album, Silver, is a marked improvement. They've stretched themselves out to incorporate and actually sound like a real band. And the songwriting is much tighter, the grooves are more muscular, and the hooks and melodies are much stronger and more memorable. While I am a vigorous proponent of double albums, this is one of those double albums that has an excellent single album somewhere in there, and most of it is on the second disc. Seriously, while listening, it feels like they completely morphed into a different band while in the process of making the record. The first disc contains too much of the soft, poppy, fluffy, mellow R&B that is way too much in vogue these days, with a few exceptions. C'est si bon, however, the French, C apostrophe EST, SIC, bon, BON, is an irresistible, delectable slice of decadent disco that makes you want to reach for a few grams of cocaine, a mirror, and a razor blade. I swear. Entry level is low down, dirty funk, and Questions is the kind of sleepy, sleek, social commentary pop funk that would make Prince proud. The second disc is where this album really takes off, though. Never Say Never has a sprightly bounce that recalls early 1980s Talking Heads, while the subtle psychedelic soul of Echo in the Chamber recalls Shuggy Otis. That's a reference for you. Norma is a pure disco floor burner a la 1978. And the album ends with the title track, Silver, a lovely mid-tempo space funk that stretches out to 9 minutes. And those mediocre vocal harmonies I mentioned earlier from their first album, it appears a whole year of touring and gigging have helped the ladies in Say She improve in that area. It's an overall solid 3.5-star album that proves the sum can be better than its parts. Chris?
No doubt. No doubt. It's a really interesting exercise. It's much more sensual than most of the stuff that you get these days. Just on first listen, I like what I hear.
Yeah. Right.
From what I understand and from what I've read about this record, they actually did record it on analog equipment. And so not only are they going for disco reverence, they're actually recording in that style, so
they want that sound.
Yeah. They want that 1978 thing. And they pretty much get it. They practically steal a few bass lines from Chic. There's a couple of things on the second disc where Donna Summer is clearly an influence.
Right.
And so, and I too am a big fan of Chez Chibon, and you must have read my notes because I refer to it as cocaine lounge music of the highest order.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is, you and I are former New Yorkers, or we used to live in New York. How many of those black shirt people hanging out after having Coke and just drinking on their fine cocktails bars did we try to hang out in?
A bunch when we were still finding ourselves in the city.
Yeah. Newsflash. We did not fit in. But we tried. We tried. From what you said, and I'm not familiar with the first disc, honestly. It doesn't sound like I want to be, but if from what you've said, that is quite a leap from one year to the next to get this, to capture that kind of sophistication. And they're not just doing karaoke. I think that they actually have some chops. I mean, there's some interesting stuff going on. It's
and then the band they have behind them is really improved. They've improved as singers.
Yeah, they have their own tempos.
As writers. Yeah. So hopefully their next album will be better,
Yeah, absolutely. And in the meantime, keep banging the Chez Chibon.
Yeah.
That's the thing that goes there. So we've come to, I guess it happens every 3 or 4 months where I get to take out my badge and refer to myself officially as a King Gizzardologist.
Yeah.
And here we have the latest and truly not greatest release from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, Australia's favorite jam band / chameleon of rock and all forms that you can think of. This album is called The Silver Chord. And I got to say, it's probably my least favorite or second least favorite of the King Gizzard records that we've covered during the life of this podcast. I would advise folks to listen to this album once for the amusement of what these guys are trying to do here, and then move on. Specifically, we find Stu McKenzie and his bandmates attempting Motorique, and also other German and disco influenced sounds. So basically, think like late 70s industrial ish stuff. There's been interviews where Stu McKenzie says that Giorgio Moroder's stuff from the mid to late 70s is an influence, which that's news to anybody who's heard the record and has actually heard Moroder too. I don't know where the hell they got that, because it's not there. But basically, it's these guys trying their best to ape the Germans. It just basically it's a really lazy, from what I can bet. It's just like, hey man, why don't we try doing an electro record about more dragons and shit? Let's earlier in the record we did earlier in the year in 2023 we did this album called Petrodragonic Apocalypse, where we thrash metaled our way through it about a demon lizard that's born from the sludge of how climate change and a big ass tornado ruins the world. Well, similarly, it's not nearly as interesting here, but there's more, there's more ghouls and goblins, and it just adds up to a really boring, sloppy, ridiculous mess. And so they probably should have just done this as another thrash album and called, maybe Petrodragonic Apocalypse Part 2. I mean, any album
might as well do something they haven't done before, because they already did cheesy electro soul with Butterfly 3000. Just go ahead and do a bluegrass album.
I mean, this is different. Yeah, exactly. King Gizzard doing bluegrass. This isn't quite. I mean, I like Butterfly 3000 because I thought as a dream pop record about becoming a father for the first time, it was pretty good. This one is not dream pop. It doesn't count as disco. It doesn't count as Motorik from the Germans. It just is just like, hey, why don't we just use old school keyboards and just sound like we belong somewhere in a disco, or have like one leg in a disco and like the others in a MOR 80s radio station. It's pretty ridiculous. I'll make a comparison here. The only album that may be worse than this one of the ones I've covered. Now keep in mind, this band has released 11 albums. If you include the EP and live record, they've released 11 in the life of this podcast, which goes back to January 2021. Now, this is the 7th of these I've covered here in the Parallel Universe. Now, the only one that may be worse than the Silver Cord is last year's Omnium Gatherum, which really was an unfocused mess and played like odds and sods and leftovers from several of the other records. It was really ridiculous. But no one can really say the Silver Cord was a mess. I mean, it's definitely done on purpose and is consistent with the band's MO of wearing 3 or 4 musical suits a year just for the hell of it. The problem is that the output is just shitty. And so, the songs are weak. The terrible rapping from Omnium Gatherum reappears.
Yeah.
I mean,
they really should put like a moratorium on hip hop, because this is not a genre King Gizzard should get involved in.
Yeah, I know. At least on Omnium, they were trying to ape Prince. Here, it's just, I don't know what the hell they're doing. They're just like, it's just slop. So, and so I will say this, though. I do wonder how the utterly moronic Gilgamesh would sound as speed metal. That might be a cool ass listen. It might still be a bad song, but it'll at least be a cool listen. Anyway, I have done the hard work of listening and analyzing the Silver Cord, so you do not have to. Hear it on the drive to work, and then do not pass go or collect $200. And that's that. Arturo?
Yeah, one of the things that makes King Gizzard such a special, endearing band is their adventurousness and how willing they are to really go out on a limb and experiment and try new and different things. But here's the thing that even the most ardent King Gizzard fans and fans of any band or artist have to realize. Just because an artist experiments and does something new and different, it doesn't mean it's automatically good. Okay. Experiments can fail. They're not always good. Let's stop being fanboys of all these bands. Oh, they're trying something good. Let's give them an award. Let's give them an A for effort. Fuck that. We're not in the business of giving A for effort. Give us good results.
Yeah.
And
this is the conundrum that King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard find themselves in. Yes, going all over the place is what we love about them. But if we're going to praise them when their experiments work, we should equally be honest when those experiments don't work. Correct. 2 years ago, they put out an album that you mentioned, Chris, Butterfly 3000, which was their first foray into full-on electronica. You like it more than I do. I think the result was a sloppy mess of cheesy, corny, lightweight electro soul that amounted to nothing more than third-rate craft work without the pop songwriting chops. This album is mostly more of the same, but there are at least two or a couple of good tracks that keep it from being complete shit. Why is that? Because as their underrated album from last year, Made in Timeland, shows, King Gizzard's forays into electronica work best when they delve into hard-driving, heavy techno aimed at the dance floor. Why is that? Because at their core, King Gizzard are a rock band. Yep. If they're going electronic, break out those fucking block rockin' beats, yo.
Yeah.
they only do that on 2 tracks here, Set and Swan Song. When they go full on techno is the only time when they're convincing when they're doing electronica. Check out those 2 tracks and disregard the rest of the album.
Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
Well, like we mentioned earlier, the overall arching theme of this particular episode of 1966 of the Second Golden Age of Rock series is psychedelia. And this is the year where psychedelia and psychedelic rock entered the mainstream. We'll talk about albums and especially singles where just lysergic music became a thing that mainstream rock audiences embraced. But like we also mentioned earlier in this episode, there are 3 particular bands/artists that stood above everyone else with arguably 3 of the 20 greatest albums ever made and among their best work. And the first band we're going to start with is an artist for whom I would say LSD and other drugs really, really, really opened his particular mind and expanded his musical boundaries and ended up in some of the greatest popular music ever made. But it didn't last long because he kind of went out of his mind later.
Yeah.
But for a little while, he made arguably the greatest album of all time. Chris?
Correct. We're talking about the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson. Wilson is a fascinating case study when mental illness, emotional sensitivity, and way too many drugs intersect.
Yeah.
And not only that, but also, you give a guy who's already made millions of dollars and has those introverse tendencies, give him the keys to the studio and any studio musicians he wants to that have the talent to kind of bring his crazy and sort of deep and genius level musical ideas to life. And That's pretty much what you get. So let's talk about the Beach Boys and their album Pet Sounds. I'm pretty sure you've heard of it. The Beach Boys' resident genius, Brian Wilson, suffered a nervous breakdown near the end of 1964. He just wasn't made for his times. So the rest of the Beach Boys stayed on the road, keeping the endless summer alive and on brand. Meanwhile, Wilson set up shop in the studio away from his bandmates and abusive father and manager Murray, while also beginning an ill-fated experimentation with drugs and not just LSD.
Yeah.
Wilson brought in studio aces, including guitarist Glenn Campbell, yes, that Glenn Campbell, bassist Carol Kay, and drummer Hal Blaine to help him translate an increasingly ambitious musical vision. The rest of the Beach Boys came in off the road to assemble majestic, glorious five-part harmonies, and Pet Sounds, perhaps rock's greatest album. Seriously, go look at lots of charts. Most charts, it's either number one or number two, was born. Now, Brian Wilson once told Rolling Stone back in the late 80s, quote, "Being called a musical genius was a cross to bear. Genius is a big word, but if you have to live up to something, you might as well live up to that," end quote. And he certainly did here. Wilson's bandmate, the marvelous singer and world-renowned asshole Mike Love, famously referred to the songs on Pet Sounds as ego music. But in a way, that's actually an apt description of the album in the best sense.
I think he referred to "Smile" as ego music.
No. He referred to this as ego music
really?
As well.
Okay.
Yeah, this is where the ego music thing started. Yeah. In a way, like I said, it's actually an apt description of the album in the best sense of that term rather than the worst. So in a way, Love, hey, he was complimentary. Wilson set out to make a pop music symphony that captured his feelings of loneliness, alienation, romantic longing, and heartbreak. To help him do so, he brought in a guy named Tony Asher, an advertising professional, to craft the lyrics. From the collective brains of Wilson and Asher came warm yet haunted classics such as Wouldn't It Be Nice, You Still Believe in Me, God Only Knows, and I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. In another interview circa 2000, Wilson said, "I think because I felt so sad, I had to bring out all my feelings and try to create music that would make me and all my friends feel better." As a result, this album, Pet Sounds, is unfathomably gorgeous, with melodies and harmonies that evoke a spirituality that no one else in the history of rock has ever approached. To turn another Mike Love complaint on its head, Wilson really did have something approximating dog ears. I mean, it was really a funny comment by Love, considering that his best lead vocals in the entire Beach Boys catalog are on Pet Sounds.
Yeah.
Regardless, even the accidents on Pet Sounds somehow make sense. Check out the bicycle horn near the end of You Still Believe in Me, which is my personal favorite song on Pet Sounds. The basic track was recorded with a different, more impish lyrical concept in mind. And yet that horn, kind of a double, beep, beep, which, Wilson left in the final result somehow adds texture and an odd teardrop to the song's lovely chime and organ-laden Baroque coda, which follows a really stunningly mature expression of devotion to the woman who puts up with him. Also, check out the wonderful old Caribbean folk song called Sloop John B., which we spoke about at length on our episode counting down the 30 top rock covers of all time. Miraculously, the Beach Boys singers infused the same innocence they supplied to the band's early odes to surfing, cars, and girls into this bitchy, ironically jolly tale of an ill-fated sea voyage. It's a neat trick in an album full of them. Pet Sounds is one of those albums that's kind of like the movie Citizen Kane, where absorbing its true greatness in one sitting is virtually impossible. Even as I listened to this album for possibly the 300th or 301st full sitting to prepare for this episode, I was struck for the first time by how the strings underneath the bridge harmonies on God Only Knows add even more beauty and depth to those vocals than I had previously realized. Wilson made a masterpiece here, and he knew it. His attempt to top himself, the next year's Smile, devolved into drugged-out messiness bordering on lunacy, including...
Well, it never came out.
Yeah, and it never came out. For the sake of sanity and order, the band rightfully abandoned the album's production, and they left Wilson to play piano in a sandbox that he had inserted in his living room. Yes, that's true. Go look it up, folks. And yet Wilson damn near did top himself on that record. That's the saddest part of the towering accomplishment of Pet Sounds. Wilson had higher and more pristine places he could have gone had his mind not completely melted down. As it is, Pet Sounds is the elegiac expression of a man at the end of his emotional rope, one that perhaps has influenced all pop music that has come after it. It can even be argued that without Pet Sounds' classical volleys and warm tones, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's may have lost some of its own classical music charm.
Sure.
This is one of rock's greatest gifts, one that will never stop giving. Arturo.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder, he co-wrote most of these tracks with this guy, Tony Asher. I wonder how much acid and pot they did together, because Asher really wrote the lyrics, but he really got into Brian Wilson's head.
Oh yeah,
because these lyrics, a lot of them have to do with breakups. It starts with the beginning of a relationship, it ends with the end of a relationship, and all things in between, in particular coming of age and realizing that the world isn't a very good place.
Right.
And they're very emotional, very personal, emotional words without being sentimental. And that's a trick a lot of songwriters really aren't good at.
No,
they
not
can't
at all.
really do that, be emotional without being sentimental. Those are two different things.
Yeah.
I also think any discussion of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys in 1966 and this year has to mention the single Good Vibrations.
Oh, absolutely.
This was released in the fall of 66. This was recorded during the Smile sessions. Brian Wilson was multitasking like a motherfucker during this time. He was conceiving, producing, arranging, even a lot of cases performing, getting session musicians together to do the stuff that would become Smile. Plucked from these sessions, he also on the side formulated a single called Good Vibrations, because Pet Sounds didn't sell that well. It only went as far as, I think, number 10 on the Billboard pop charts, even though it was huge in the UK. And he really felt the pressure to come out with a big pop single, because Pet Sounds didn't produce that pop single. So with Good Vibrations, he put out what he described many times and has been quoted many times as saying a pocket symphony. Basically, it's not quite, it's progressive pop in the purest sense. It's not even progressive rock. It's like progressive pop. Yeah. And it's a multi-section suite that breathtakingly goes from one movement to another without ever abandoning the listener's ear, with maintaining the attention of the listener, with those beautiful harmonies, with just these just lush arrangements that just lead to this amazing, the theremin, the famous theremin.
Yeah, bust out the theremin, baby.
Yeah. But you have to talk about Good Vibrations, one of the greatest singles of all time. That was a massive hit, worldwide hit when it came out. So it gave Brian Wilson some leeway and a buffer to continue working on Smile. Yeah. Like, okay, all right, Brian, you got a big hit you have this critically acclaimed masterpiece with Pet Sounds. Now you have this critically acclaimed and commercial huge hit with Good Vibrations. All right, go ahead and do Smile. Well, what happened? The band members, all of them, hated it. Yep. Throughout the years, people have said, Carl Wilson said, no, I was okay with it. Dennis Wilson said he supported it. Bullshit. None of them liked it. The reaction among the band was split with Pet Sounds. It wasn't split with the Smile results. Wilson was taking too many drugs. He was having his mental health issues were getting the best of him at this time, and the drugs were exacerbating that whole issue. Yeah. And what happened is that he just had another nervous psychological breakdown and just basically fell into a depression that would last for a really long time.
About 8 years. Yeah.
Even more than that. Cause then then in 8 years later, he would bring that shrink who came to,
Eugene Landy,
who saved his life at first, but then just completely dominated and manipulated him in a way, financially, emotionally, psychologically, that kind of almost ruined him. But that's another story.
That certainly is another story. And Good Vibrations is the one positive output from Smile that hit the street and kind of justified it. Without Good Vibrations, you probably don't get the cult of Smile. And there really is a cult of Smile that, the way that he pulled off. I mean, Good Vibrations is definitely the best thing to come out of that. But there's some other stuff on there like Heroes and Villains.
Amazing stuff that came from the Smile sessions.
Vegetables.
Could have been a fantastic record had Brian Wilson had someone with him to help him edit. He didn't have that.
Yeah, I mean, especially not Van Dyke Parks. I mean, both of
No.
those guys were whacked out of their minds at that point. So
Yeah.
it's too bad. And so now we moved on from guys who were whacked out of their minds to a guy who had
Whacked out even more on his mind.
yeah, well, there's that, but he was so whacked out that he was fully in control.
Yeah.
You're talking about the maestro and the Superman of all songwriters, Bob Dylan.
Yes.
Arturo, tell us about Blonde on Blonde.
The Shakespeare of rock. Yeah, Bob Dylan is so etched in stone as this living, breathing, walking, barely walking at this point, monument to music, that it's hard for people to realize that at some point in time, a long time ago, Dylan was actually at the zenith and peak of what was hip in the pop cultural zeitgeist. This was early 1966, and Dylan was riding such a wave, combined with the huge commercial success of the previous year, which saw both his album, Highway 61 Revisited, and two timeless classic singles, Like a Rolling Stone and Positively 4th Street, hit the top 10 in both the Billboard album and singles charts, respectively. This was also the time when Dylan had fully crossed over to the electric rock and roll and pop sphere, angering folk purists who wanted to see Dylan remain a politically conscious folk singer, continually writing politically minded folk songs for just voice and acoustic guitar. Basically, they wanted him to be Phil Oakes. No, Dylan wasn't having that. And not only did his decision open up his appeal to a broader audience, it made his music more enduring and, shall we say, more time-proof as the decades would slide by. So, the time came to record the follow-up to Highway 61 Revisited. From October 1965 through January of 1966, Dylan did numerous recording sessions with producer Bob Johnston that spanned both studios in both New York and Los Angeles. It spurned two studios, and he still couldn't get it right. The band he was using for these sessions was his touring band at the time, known as the Hawks, who would in a couple of years' time be widely known as the Band. Rest in peace, Robbie Robertson. The sessions did not go well. Dylan was not satisfied with anything they were doing except for one song, One of Us Must Know, which was released as a single in February and flopped, reaching only at 119 on the Billboard singles chart. It's too bad because it's a gorgeous song, detailing a romantic breakup amidst a backdrop that can be described as dark, gothic, carnivalesque, with its loping organ and cyclical structure. It was kept on the album that would eventually become Blonde on Blonde. Bob Johnston, the producer who lived in Nashville, Tennessee at the time, suggested that Dylan should record there with the highly acclaimed crew of session musicians that played on hundreds of country music records at the time. Dylan agreed, and the only musicians he brought with him from the New York and LA sessions were guitarist Robbie Robertson and keyboardist Al Cooper. This time, the results were the 180-degree opposite of what came from the previous sessions. In a roughly 1 month period from mid-February to mid-March, Dylan and the Nashville crew nailed down all the songs that would be on the record. Dylan and everyone else was so satisfied with the music that it was decided to be released as a double album. Now, double LPs had been released before, but they were usually in the realm of classical music or film scores. Blonde on Blonde was essentially the first album in the realm of contemporary popular music to be a double album, yet another way in which Bob Dylan was a pioneer and trailblazer. All this history wouldn't matter, though, if the music on this album wasn't among the most masterful and well-crafted, not just of Dylan's career, but in the entire canon of rock and roll. First off, this is the first Dylan album that is actually produced. When I say that, I mean it has its own distinctive production sound. His early folk records were exactly that. Folk records, just voice, acoustic guitar, harmonica, stick Dylan in front of a microphone and press record. When he ventured into rock and roll and bringing it all back home in early 1965, it was raw. It was a raw garage rock sound. With Highway 61 Revisited from the same year, it was a heavier, denser, more expansive rock sound, but it was still raw and didn't sound sonically out of place for much of the pop music at the time. Blonde on Blonde, however, was a different beast. Dylan has been famously quoted many times regarding his description of the album as having that quote unquote wild, thin Mercury sound. And he's exactly right. There's an overall shiny sheen to the record. The guitars have a sparkle that snaps at the listener. The drums have a crispness to them that focus on the snare. And then there are the songs. This is the absolute apex of Dylan's Dadaist, surrealist phase of song lyricism. Even the songs that are most obtuse or even abstract are fascinating in their vivid, striking, and sometimes even haunting imagery. Visions of Johanna may well be one of the most beautiful and moving songs in Dylan's entire catalog, with its gorgeous roving melody writing a story of a doomed love triangle. Rainy Day, number 12 and 35, and most likely You Go Your Way and I'll Go Mine are the opening tracks on each of the discs, and both are the quote-unquote joke songs on the record, each of them driven by a marching band horn section. The former is one of the most notorious songs on the album, not just for said marching band sounding drunk, but for its drug references in the chorus. When Dylan sings "Everybody Must Get Stoned," he's actually referring to the act of stoning, a public shaming ritual dating back to biblical times when people would throw stones at someone who committed a criminal offense. But come on, Dylan knew what he was doing when he put "Everybody Must Get Stoned" in the chorus. Believe it or not, this song went all the way to number 2 on the Billboard Pop Singles chart. There's also the galloping, jaunty beauty of "I Want You," one of the most unabashed love songs in Dylan's repertoire, rendered in one of the most thickly metaphorical set of lyrics the man ever penned. This made it to number 20 on the Billboard Singles chart. Then there's also the mournful, sweepingly gorgeous "Just Like a Woman," Dylan's aching send-off to Andy Warhol socialite Edie Sedgwick, a woman he had a brief affair with. This track, with its harmonica melody "On Loan from God," hit number 33 on the Billboard Singles chart. And most of those songs are just from the first disc. The second disc is equally loaded with songs most artists would pimp their mothers to have written. Dylan goes surf rock with "Absolutely Sweet Marie." He responds to the Beatles' "Norwegian Wood" with the waltz time beauty of "Fourth Time Around." And he just about rips the listener's heart out with his moving elegiac tribute to his at the time new wife, Sarah, with "Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands." The theme of this episode is psychedelia, like we said before. And while there's nothing musically psychedelic about Blonde on Blonde, Dylan absolutely gets there with his lyrics, which can put you in a lysergic mood without any drugs whatsoever. There seems to be a notion among also, the pretentious indie hipster douchebag set of fans and critics that most double albums are bloated and indulgent and should be single albums. Not only is that a steaming pile of horse shit, in fact, it's one of the curmudgeonly tenets that most double albums are either among an artist's best work or it is their best work. Yeah. It's a criminal insult to one of Dylan's top 3 very best albums, in my opinion, a record that doesn't have a single wasted note. But you disagree, hey, Chris?
Yeah, I do. I do think that obviously this album's awesome. It's 5 stars. It probably belongs in the top 50 albums, just objectively, of all time. But I do think that it does suffer from being a little too long and a little too indulgent. I think that, obviously he figured out the benefits of real production and probably enjoyed being able to be at the mercy of those Nashville session pros plus Robbie Robertson. Yeah. But it could have done without Fourth Time Around, which, like you said, is kind of a joking response to Norwegian Wood.
It's a beautiful song. It's awesome.
Yeah, there's that. I mean, I Want You, which is okay, but it's a ditty. And so maybe you could have done without that.
It's the pop ditty that the album needed.
Yeah, but what I'm saying, it's so yeah. So I mean, obviously, the cornerstones of the record are "Visions of Johanna" and "Sad Eyed Lady of Lowland." Both of those songs are incredible. The lyrics, the chorus, the melody, everything. Those are just a couple of perfect songs. I've also always been a fan of the blues stuff on there, "Pledging My Time" and "Leopard Skin Pillbox Hat." I think you know where I'm going. I think the first disc is better than the second disc. I think that it just was a little too long, and I think that had he tightened it up, remove just like 3 or 4 songs and make it, into a longer single record, it would have benefited, and it would have been just about as perfect as Highway 61 Revisited. And for that matter, you said that this was the first really produced record in Dylan's catalog. I think that that's one of the reasons I also prefer Highway 61 Revisited, is that lack of production. It's just that these guys bashing out in the studio over a course of 6 sessions. I mean,
that's great too. I mean, I don't think it's fair to compare the 2 albums. I mean, they're
not really. They come from
sounding beasts.
Yeah, they come from 2 different places. I understand that, and I think that in some ways, Highway 61 is more. It's not as ambitious lyrically, but I think it's more honest in some respects. I don't know. And I guess that's one of the things too, is that, Blonde on Blonde, after a while, because it's too long, there are a couple of, to me, boring spots. I don't know. To me, I would put it 5th. Honestly, I think John Wesley Harding and Love and Theft are better records. I mean, I know that.
Yeah, I don't put Love and Theft anywhere near that high.
Yeah,
I like it a lot.
There's a lot of people.
But
yeah, there's a lot of people that would accuse me of sacrilege for saying that. But so I would put this probably this album 5th. And I understand where Dylan was at. The pressure was getting on him, as far as, like you said, he wanted to go his own way, so to speak, and so there was he was getting that backlash from the folkies. There was the pressure of the London tour, which he did right after this record. So he's in a kind of a pressure cooker. And as a document of that time, and of his saying, "Well, I'm going to ramp things up even more. You're trying to put me in a hole. Well, I'm going to go even more Dadaist. I'm going to go Dadaist times 1,000." And so I think there is some of that. There's a competitiveness that I think drives this record, which is one of the things that ultimately makes it great. I just wish it was shorter. That's all.
Well, you're in a distinct minority there, Chris. However,
I've always been in a distinct minority. That's why I co-host a podcast called the Curmudgeon Rock Report. We are the distinct minority, motherfucker.
However, there's a little bit more agreement with regarding the next record, and the third of the big 3 of 1966. Gee, you can guess who they are. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, obviously. You're not going to get much disagreement from basically anybody that breathes and that's been born anytime between now and 1940 about this record. The Beatles Revolver, which obviously is in the top 5 of most credible lists of greatest albums ever made. For a reason, it actually is one of the greatest albums ever made. So let's talk about it. Coming into 1966, the Beatles had become full-blown miracle workers. The wonderful Rubber Soul was released in December of 65 and signaled that this band had a lot more to say and more sophisticated ways to say it than anyone had ever imagined 2 years prior. So what came next? A leap that was 10 times even more imaginable than that. The result of a mixture of touring and media burnout, heaping helpings of LSD and cocaine. Let's not disregard the influence of cocaine on McCartney. Sure. And an unencumbered ambition that told the band anything they touched would be more golden than King Midas could ever approach. Reasonable arguments can be made over whether Revolver is the greatest rock album ever made, but it is much less arguable to call it the art form's most adventurous record. It's obvious the Beatles had a lot of fun making the record, and this is the sound of swagger. Or as Rob Sheffield, the author of a book called Dreaming the Beatles, go check it out, folks. It's a wonderful book. He puts it this way, quote, "Rubber Soul had come as a surprise to the Beatles. Crashing it out in a few weeks for Christmas, the Beatles stumbled into a revelation of how far they could travel over the course of a full-length LP. Revolver marks the first time they set out to make a masterpiece on purpose, arrogant bastards sure that any idea they try will turn out brilliantly. And this time, at least, they're right. End quote. Yes, Revolver is indeed a work of deliberate genius. Paul McCartney revisits the string quartet treatment of Yesterday on Eleanor Rigby, except this time he strips away everything else, leaving the strings to drive the drama of All Those Lonely People exclusively. The song doubles as pop majesty and as chamber music majesty. Meanwhile, George Harrison takes that sitar part from Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, and explodes it into a full raga workout, complete with a full raga band, on Love You Too. The effect is absolutely mind-blowing. And then there's the amazing 1-2 punch that ends the record. McCartney hits first with the rousing soul workout, Got to Get You Into My Life, whipping out a horn section for the first time in the Beatles' history. It was a song good enough for the Titans of Soul, Earth, Wind, and Fire to cover a decade later, which in a fascinating way translates to the Earth, Wind, and Fire thing as much, if not more or better, than any Earth, Wind, and Fire original. Now, John Lennon then follows that with the album's best
Thank you for finally mentioning John Lennon.
Would you stop?
If it weren't for John Lennon provides all the psychedelia in this record. All of it.
Yeah, I know. Let me talk. Thank you very much. So Lennon then follows with the album's best song, Tomorrow Never Knows. Never changing from its predominant C chord, the song soars and soars and soars into a blatant tribute to the power of the psychedelic substance experience. Lennon lifts the song lyrics from a Timothy Leary treatise. In a fit of studio cleverness, McCartney inserts a loop of George Harrison's solo from the album opener Taxman, and he inserts it backwards to create one of the wildest new solos in the rock canon. Now, listening to Tomorrow Never Knows on repeat, even whilst sober, never gets old. Truly, I tell you, this is rock's greatest meditation. To me, what distinguishes Revolver from the rest of the Beatles' catalog is its balance. I know you disagree with that, Arturo, but hear me out. Was the album the finest moment for both McCartney and Lennon? Maybe so. On one end, McCartney delivers one pop gem after another. Even the corniest stuff like Good Day Sunshine is magnificent. Plus, people tell me that Here, There, and Everywhere is really hard to play on guitar. On the other end, Lennon is totally in his feels and up to his elbows in that LSD throughout, hitting tremendously emotional notes on And Your Bird Can Sing, She Said, and I'm Only Sleeping. The two meet each other in the middle, the two meaning McCartney and Lennon, meet each other in the middle on the ridiculously dreamy Yellow Submarine, co-crafting a surrealist sea shanty for Ringo Starr to croon in a charmingly dopey vocal performance. Ultimately, when we talk about a modern artist sounding Beatlesque, Revolver is the North Star for that illusion. The magic melodies, the hippie leanings, Paul's goofy cheeriness, the not quite sober harmonizing. It's all here. Revolver keeps on revolving as the decades pass, even as countless artists attempt to recycle its glory. That, I think, is its legacy. It's the monolith we can only touch. The transformation has already taken place. Enough said. Arturo?
I think they would do better albums after this, personally. I'm still a Sgt. Pepper's and White Album fanatic, and I still think those are my two favorite Beatles albums. I can write a novel about how there's not a single wasted note in the White Album, even the not so good songs. But anyway, back to Revolver. Yeah, I mean, listen, they were firing on all cylinders here. Harrison had finally come into his own a bit as a songwriter. The Indian raga he does with Love You Too is great. I think he would improve it on Sgt. Pepper's, in my opinion.
That statement is true.
Yeah. Taxman is a great song. I think you overestimated McCartney's input into Tomorrow Never Knows. Yeah, he provided that tape loop, but that whole song is John Lennon's brainchild.
Yeah.
And if you're going to give credit to anyone, you give credit to George Martin and his engineers.
Yeah, and Jeff Emmerich. Yeah, it's
they're the real unsung stars of this album.
Yes.
Even as much as any of the four, and he's as much as Lennon and McCartney.
Yeah, strange but true. I think that Glenn Johns, his first day as a professional engineer was in the recording of
Revolver.
of Tomorrow Never Knows. Can you imagine?
Oh, wow. Yeah, imagine that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this album has been written about a lot. It's been heard a lot. So there's not much more you can say. But I'll said what I said before. As great as McCartney's stuff was, take Lennon away from this album, and this album is just a Baroque. It's a really, really good Baroque pop album, not unlike The Left Bank.
But it's a little bit better than that. I mean, there's some real depth here. I mean, Eleanor Rigby, that's not
where Lennon helped with the lyrics. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm saying it's not but they helped each other. I mean, after having seen the Peter Jackson movie a year and a half ago, it's pretty clear that they help doctor each other's songs. So, the Lennon McCartney songwriting credit actually is worth more than the mythology would make it. So I think that's a fair statement,
Yeah, sure.
But what I'm saying is you get stuff like For No One, Eleanor Rigby, there's a depth to what McCartney does in some of his songs on this record. Now, granted, there is Good Day Sunshine and stuff like that, but I really think that Paul is doing some really special stuff here. And in my opinion,
so is John.
And so is John. Lennon did not peak on this record.
Right.
He peaked on the White Album and Abbey Road. But I would say that McCartney probably did peak here. I mean, he has a couple of amazing things on Sgt. Pepper's.
I'll give Paul's peak to be this and Sgt. Pepper's. Those are Paul's peaks. I'll give you that.
And so that's what I'm saying. It's not, I know you say that this is Lennon's accomplishment. I think it's both of their accomplishments. And I don't think that there's a more balanced record. Post 64. Let me just put a caveat to that. Post 1964, this is the most balanced of the records.
In a way, because the White Album is so fragmented and fractured and pulling apart at the seams.
Well, yeah, it's
true. Kind of a weird balance in itself, but that's another discussion.
Yeah, I was going to say that's anti-balance.
On this episode, we delved into the year 1966 in our second Golden Age of Rock series. For our next episode, yours truly, Curmudgeons, will get super geeky as Chris, our resident Neil Young-ologist, will perform a public service as he attempts to bring his, and by extension our, choice selections from Neil Young's Archive series. Since 2009, Uncle Neil has been opening up his archives of endless recorded live performances and unreleased studio work. The sheer volume is overwhelming, and even the hardest of hardcore Neil fans have a hard time keeping up. The live performances have so far, the key words being so far, been released as 17 live albums classified as quote-unquote the Performance Series. The unreleased studio work has so far been released as 2 volumes, each multi-disc box sets, the first covering 1963 to 72, and the second covering 1972 to 1976. The third multi-disc box set is due to come out before the year ends. So what better time to discuss Uncle Neil and the gift that keeps on giving than now? There is a lot of music to go through here, but fear not. Chris knows his Neil Young, and the Curmudgeons are here to make life easier for everyone and to let you know of only the 10 very best and choicest selections from all this live stuff and previously unreleased studio material. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you the best of the Neil Young Archive series.
Now, folks, we had called those previous 3 albums again, Revolver, Blonde on Blonde, and Pet Sounds, as a triad, as a monolithic triad for 1966. However, they were not the only game. I think that they were the main influences, and everything from there trickled down into that. And what it did is it gave the artists, it transformed the industry so that it had freedom that it never had before. And one thing we can say is that they did introduce, even if the album was invented as the album as we know it was invented in 65, it was perfected in 66, and it became the standard, that the album became a dominant expression of its own in 66. And so, Arturo, take us through some of the other fantastic and original records and albums that hit the street in 1966.
Yeah. First, we go with the Beatles' immediate rivals, the Rolling Stones, and Aftermath. Probably the most annoying aspect of the British music industry during this time was their insistence on issuing UK and US versions of an album. These would differ significantly in both running order and track selection. Unfortunately, both the Beatles and Stones fell victim to this industry practice, one that the Beatles would kill dead the following year with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Stones in particular would suffer from this, since the UK version of this album doesn't have the titanic, apocalyptically rocking single Paint It Black, which topped the charts worldwide and is the lead-off track off the US version of Aftermath. This is the first truly great album in the Stones' discography, and it's the first one to consist totally of Mick Jagger, Keith Richards originals. Always in the shadow of the Beatles at this time, the Jagger-Richards duo proved they could hold their own with some truly amazing songs. Guitarist Brian Jones's gift for arrangements shows itself in the driving sitar on Paint It Black, but also with the haunting marimba on Under My Thumb, a great song that also serves as one of Jagger's nastiest put-downs of a woman that borders on misogyny. Mother's Little Helper, however, finds Jagger oddly sympathizing with a woman, in this case, an older housewife who is barely keeping things together at home while dealing with an amphetamine addiction. That's one of the things many of Jagger's detractors conveniently ignore. He can be incredibly nasty toward women in his songs, but he can also be incredibly compassionate and tender, something he would show in later albums. Flight 505 is one of the earliest examples of the riff machine Keith Richards would become by the end of the decade. It's a great album that falls just short of perfection due to the 11-minute snooze fest, the blues jam Going Home, that ends the US version and ends side A of the UK version. Chris?
Yeah, just one note to make about the sort of the UK-US split. On the UK version, Mother's Little Helper is the opening track. Paint It Black is not on there. And I believe on the US version, at least originally, Mother's Little Helper was not. Was not.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, on Spotify specifically, they have the UK version.
That
sucks. With Mother's Little Helper and not Paint It Black. When I agree with you, because with the US version, it's a little bit better. I like Mother's Little Helper. It's a
I like it too.
Yeah,
it's
a good
ditty. Both been on.
I was going to say, if both of them were on there, then it would be that much better. The one thing I will say is that you really hear. I think this is probably the best of the Andrew Loog Oldham produced records.
Right. He would leave soon after this one.
Yeah, it's between this and Between the Buttons from the next year. I mean, it's to sort of the pre-Jimmy Miller era albums. This is a really good one, but you hear the gestation of Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed
a little bit.
You start to hear this, like I said, the gestation. This is the conception gestation phase, and so you get those country music leanings and blues leanings on stuff like Mother's Little Helper and Lady Jane and Don't You Bother Me, which may actually be my favorite song on the record. I mean, that's a crucial giveaway here that they were starting to, as they were finding themselves as songwriters, that American vernacular music was one of the things that was affecting their vocabulary. They weren't a straight pop band. They never really were a straight pop band, even though Under My Thumb is a perfect pop song. They never really did that. They didn't go full-fledged into being the greatest white blues rock band of all time. But the hints are there, man. The hints are there.
Yeah. Well, you have the Beatles, you have the Stones, and you have the Kinks.
Yep.
The Kinks, Face to Face. This is the first in a colossal run of masterpiece albums by this band, and it heralds the arrival of Ray Davies as master songwriter and chronicler of the British social class system. Hinted at the previous year with the excellent single Well Respected Man, this is the first album where you get to hear Davies' patented character vignettes, character sketches, all giving us tales of down on their luck people navigating their everyday lives while providing biting and cutting social commentary. Sunny Afternoon, the biggest hit from the album, hitting number 14 in the US, number 1 in the UK, and the top 10 throughout Europe, follows the downfall of a wealthy aristocrat from the aristocrat's perspective. A House in the Country is one of the angriest songs in the band's discography, with Davies playing the character of a working class yabbo who envies the life of an upper middle class guy who lives not far from him. Holiday in Waikiki is one of the earliest songs ever written about gentrification, detailing the environmental and cultural costs that the tourism industry can invoke. Musically, it's also a departure for the Kinks at the time, as Davies started to lead the band away from the R&B and heavy riff rock roots, and more into traditional English music hall styles that would characterize the band's music later on. You can hear this on tracks like Dandy and Little Miss Queen of Darkness. Subtle psychedelia isn't too far away, though, as can be heard in the ominous darkness of Rainy Day in June, Fancy, and even the outro of Little Miss Queen of Darkness. It's a rich, eclectic, lyrically deep collection of songs that may be the Kinks' most underrated album. Chris?
Yeah, I agree. I think to me, when you, the Fuzzbox is definitely gone.
Yeah.
And by the Fuzzbox lads that broke out with You Really Got Me in 64, that is way gone by this. And this is the beginning of what most of us that count ourselves as rock and roll enthusiasts, when we think of the Kinks, this is what we think of: cleverly rendered, masterfully arranged ditties, flashing oodles of satirical wit, as you've alluded to. And I love Sunny Afternoon, by the way.
Yeah.
That is just, to me, that is quintessential Kinks. When I think of the Kinks, that's the first song I hear in my head. Wonderful little melody. It's got that, it's almost funny. It's almost, the melody is perfect, but it almost has a bop to it that it's like him telling a music hall joke. It's like he's on like the British vaudeville stage telling a joke, and so it's like that, hey everybody, and sort of that whole thing. So it's just wonderful. And yeah, I agree. I think that this probably is their most underrated record. I mean, the 3 or 4 that came after this are the ones that are celebrated, but Face to Face kind of gets left not kind of sort of in the dust. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, it does. It should be listed up there. I think it's a 5-star classic. It's on my list of the 500 greatest studio albums of all time, but that's coming much, 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 much later.
Absolutely.
All right. Next, Simon and Garfunkel with not 1, but 2 albums. Memorable, even if they're not all great. Sounds of Silence and Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme both came out this year in 66. When Simon and Garfunkel hit it big with the epic single The Sound of Silence in the fall of 1965, they were rushed into the studio by their record label, Columbia, to make a full-length album in order to capitalize on the single's success. The resulting record, Sounds of Silence, was released in early 1966 and is a testament to how pressure can sometimes give an artist a sense of focus and have them create some of their best work. I love this album.
Yeah, it is pretty good.
The folk rock sound of The Sound of Silence was mostly retained here and augmented to some of Paul Simon's most moving and poetic songs. I Am a Rock, which was a massive single, hit number 3 on the Billboard singles chart, is an ode to loneliness that hits home with its subtle sense of despair. Loneliness is the overall arching theme on this album, with the songs Richard Cory, I Am a Rock, A Most Peculiar Man, Richard Cory and A Most Peculiar Man also presenting sad and in some cases suicidal characters. I think it's the duo's second best album after Bridge Over Troubled Water, and proves that Bob Dylan and the Byrds weren't the only ones who were doing killer folk rock at the time. The other album, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, though, found the duo taking much more time in the studio, and the results are mixed. You have sentimental tripe like Cloudy and The Dangling Conversation, as well as silly Dylan pastiche with the ridiculously titled A Simple Desultory Philippic. But talk about pretentious.
Yeah.
but you also have Homeward Bound, one
Yeah.
of Simon's most rousing sing-along songs, and a huge
Absolutely.
hit as well, going to number 5 in the pop singles chart. There's also the duo's achingly beautiful and definitive rendition of the Old English folk song Scarborough Fair, and, of course, the 59th Street Bridge song, Feelin' Groovy, one of the greatest I Love New York songs ever written. Chris?
Yeah, I think that I would hope that that Paul Simon still pays a referral fee or a tip to Bob Dylan when he gets his checks, just because it's pretty clear that without Dylan, Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel would not have broken out to the extent that they did. They took advantage of the climate that was looking, folk rock, more folk rock. And because remember, they did Wednesday, 3 a.m. A couple years earlier to not much fanfare. That included the original version of Sound of Silence, which is just an acoustic guitar accompanied. It's the same vocal, but not, without the keys and without the drums. So you're right. I mean, there's just the sing-along quality of some of that stuff. Homeward Bound is a personal favorite of mine. I grew up with I Am a Rock. That was one of my mom's favorite songs. And, obviously Scarborough Fair and just, all of that stuff. I mean, Simon just was a really, really gifted songwriter. Garfunkel was a really, really a gifted vocalist. And you put them together and you get this. And so maybe it was a happy accident that they were trying to break out at the same time as Dylan was becoming huge. But thank you, Bob. Because and thank you, Paul, because without you being so good, Bob opened the door and you slammed your ass through it. So more power to you.
Right. All right. The next great album of 66, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention with Freak Out. I mentioned how Bob Dylan was the first artist in the realm of popular music to release a double album. Who was the second? Frank Zappa.
Yep.
And he did so with his first album, Freak Out, which was released under the moniker of his band at the time, the Mothers of Invention. Zappa would go on to make better, and in my opinion, much better albums as his career would progress. However, Freak Out finds Zappa at his most musically conventional and accessible, even with all the joke songs and social satire. Go Cry on Somebody Else's Shoulder shits on sentimental doo-wop, made more poignant by the fact that Zappa himself was quite the fan of doo-wop. You Didn't Try to Call Me and I Ain't Got No Heart satirize romantic folk rock, while Motherly Love provides dark comedy with the incestual undertones of smothering parental attention. But the band were called the Mothers of Invention for a reason, and there's plenty of new musical ground being broken here. Who Are the Brain Police has a creepy bass line that introduces a track that is one of the few times Zappa ever allowed himself to truly indulge in unsettling psychedelia, especially with the song's break in the middle. Trouble Every Day has the distinction of being one of the greatest songs in Zappa's catalog and is unusually one of his most straightforward. It's a raging blues rocker with some nifty guitar work that also serves as Zappa's thoughts on the Watts race riots that hit Los Angeles the previous year. What makes the song work is that it starts as a commentary on race relations. Hint, Zappa is no fan of law enforcement and detests racism, but the song progresses into his general contempt for consumerist society and how somehow in America everything becomes entertainment. In 2023, Zappa was right.
Yep.
Yeah. Over 50 years later, almost 60, Zappa was prescient.
Yes.
The album ends with "Help, I'm a Rock," a song whose title satirizes Simon and Garfunkel's hit song, which is pretty funny, and the return of the son of Monster Magnet. Both of these songs are two sonic experiments. The former, "Help, I'm a Rock," in repetition, and the latter, the return of the son of Monster Magnet, in the kind of musique concrete that Zappa would explore in the near future. The album is a near masterpiece that is an exemplary introduction to the long, rich discography of Frank Zappa. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing about freak out in this period for Zappa, I like to look at, if you can basically sum up Zappa's catalog and progression as an artist, I think 3 words capture it: maturity in reverse.
Yeah.
He kind of degenerated into titty jokes by the end of his road. But here, the social commentary is straight on. The guitar playing is just awesome. I mean, this is one of the better guitar records of that era. I mean, obviously, it doesn't necessarily touch Hot Rats and and like the Uncle Meat and like the really great stuff. But this is Zappa's first taste of real freedom. It's like, anybody that tried to put Zappa in a box, you couldn't do it. He's a classically trained guy, and he just it was hard to take him seriously. Well, and again, you can pretty much attribute this to Dylan and the Beatles and the psychedelic thing, because it gave him, because the thing about Zappa was that he while he was a horribly notorious womanizer, he detested drugs. And so thank God for the guys who were on drugs, because it gave Zappa the freedom to do his thing and make it sound like it was conventional.
Right.
for the times,
exactly.
for the times. And so, in a way, he owes his career to the acid heads. So you pretty much captured it for the rest of the record. It's a really sharp, satirical, well put together, and largely conventional, slyly conventional. Like, he gets away with a lot, like you said, like Motherly Love and stuff like that. So good stuff. And again, thank you, Bob, and more especially, thank you, Acid.
For this. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to throw you a curveball, Chris. I did not include this in our episode outline.
Okay.
The 13th floor elevators. The psychedelic sounds of the 13th floor elevators.
Rocky, baby. Rocky.
Yes. Coming from Austin, Texas, this band of genuinely, legitimately crazy acid heads are one of the few bands of this era to be considered precursors to punk rock. They may not have been punk in idealism, but they certainly were in attitude and spirit. Their music itself was not necessarily psychedelic. It was more revved up garage and folk rock. But my, oh my, were their lyrics ever so psychedelic. Tommy Hall, who on stage played an amplified jug, provided most of the words that were sung in the high-pitched wail by one Rocky Erickson, the band's leader and direction mover. The single, "You're Gonna Miss Me," was a big regional hit, but only went as far as number 55 on the national singles chart. Yet, that song is not indicative of the high-octane rock and roll and acid-fried lyrics contained in this album. Check out Reverberation. The song has one of the creepiest, eeriest guitar riffs of the era, and it does its damn best to convey an acid trip in words. Try listening to Kingdom of Heaven and not feel like you're being levitated by its trippy majesty. It's one of the best albums of 1966 and one of the best of all time. Chris?
Yeah, it's one thing I say about the 13 floor elevators. It's kind of like, I've made this comment about when I talk about the Grateful Dead's Anthem of the Sun, is that picture a shattered stained glass church window. And, some pieces are more beautiful and more charming than the others. And so what it is it's an assembled smattering of pieces. But when you put them together, sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't, but it's all adventurous. The pile becomes the whole. It's not the glass, it's not the Virgin Mary in glass. It's just, it's red, it's blue, it's yellow, it's green, it's orange, and it sparkles in the sun. And so it's an album of pieces. And at times it's really beautiful. It's oddly beautiful in many respects. And so God bless Rocky and God bless the others for legitimately there were I guess you could say that there's a subgenre of meltdown bands.
Yeah.
This is one of the foremost and finest.
Unlike the Beach Boys, they never made it big.
Nope.
Yeah. All right. The last full-length album we'll mention here, The Monks, Black Monk Time. Now, we talked about this album in detail in one of our Vault segments from, I think, 2 years ago.
Yeah, from a long time ago. Yeah.
This album should be mentioned again. 4 American soldiers stationed in Germany in the mid-1960s decide to form a band, dress up as Catholic monks on stage for visual effect and, I suppose, subversive humor, and bash out an aggressive style of ruthless garage rock that, while it didn't sell any records at the time, proved to be a huge under-the-radar underground influence on legions of garage rock and punk bands in the future. None other than Jack White himself has called this one of his all-time favorite albums and a big influence on the White Stripes. And you can certainly hear it in the pounding intensity of songs like Complication and the wonderfully titled I Hate You. This was punk when the word punk just meant prison slang for a guy who took it up the ass. Chris?
Yeah, pretty much. Proto garage.
Yeah.
This is definitely proto garage. It's a fun record. It's a wacky record. It's a record that needs to be heard to be believed. It's that much fun. And it's, for 4 guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't their backstory is that they're 4 American guys who were stationed in the Army?
Yes.
And so this was kind of their way of not going insane under all the regimenting of military life. And so there you go. So God bless the United States Army, without which we would not get the Monks.
Well, the Monks, I believe. Okay, hold on a second, Chris. You mentioned that there were 4 guys. There were 5 guys. Sorry,
5 guys.
Yeah.
There were 5 guys, and so they again, the military blues comes out as proto garage, baby. Good stuff.
Yeah. All right. So now we did the albums. Now we got to go into, now we're getting to the deep psychedelia. Now, these are the songs of rock singles of 66 that were truly psychedelic. Chris, you're gonna go through them for us.
Yeah, so let's kind of do a little bit of lightning round with these. This was kind of the 65 kind of laid the groundwork, but where the garage came in 65. This is where the garage plus acid comes in, and so you get some truly majestic and weird stuff going on here. And somehow most of this, or if all of this, either became hits or became cult favorites. Go figure. So here we go. The Byrds, 8 Miles High. Now, if anyone in history was ever qualified to write and sing a song called 8 Miles High, it was David Crosby. Here's a guy that, that the Byrds had in the year prior had really innovated and practically invented folk rock, and with Turn, Turn, Turn and some of that stuff. Well, here they grow even more adventurous and even more sort of mind-bending with what they were doing. This is, I believe, or is the best of the Roger McGuinn 12-string guitar work. Just really, really exciting riff that just keeps looking at the heavens. And it's just kind of this aggressive, just crunchy, gnarly music track with this really sort of soft, hummable it's a striking juxtaposition. And, it's like this ugliness juxtaposed with this prettiness, and the prettiness obscures some truly like psychedelic and must have been influenced by drugs lyrics. I mean, come on, we have a line: round the squares, huddled in storms, some laughing, some just shapeless forms. I mean, is he talking about corny people? Is he talking about actually geometric shapes? Doesn't matter.
Yeah, check out the lyrics to the song Fifth Dimension. That's even more acid fried.
Yeah, exactly. The logic here really washes away, and pure, majestic, ever-soaring wild beauty predominates. Arturo, what say you about 8 Miles High?
Oh, I think it's the Byrds' single greatest song. It's their greatest song ever of any version of the band, whether it's the original version, whether it's the country version of Sweetheart of the Rodeo later with Graham Parsons, whether it's the country rock, folk rock, kind of folk rock, but like the ones the iteration of the band later in 1969 and 70, in which Roger McGuinn was the only original member. It's their single best song. It's basically Ravi Shankar meets John Coltrane, backed up by a tripped out acid fried rock and roll band.
Yep, that's actually not a bad description, especially the Ravi Shankar part. Go figure. Yeah. So moving on, the Lovin' Spoonful, Summer in the City. This was another band, kind of like Zappa, or artists that benefited from the ridiculousness of what was coming out of other people's acid or other people's drug experiences.
But these guys were genuine folk musicians, though.
Yeah, these guys they're folk musicians from New York City. They're Greenwich Village born, tried and true. And here, what they do is they're able to experiment with the sound and play with reverb, play with electric piano, play with that mood, this kind of spooky, kind of drugged out, I'm stuck in a hallway mood. But really, it's a song about, hey, we're melting in the city by day and partying by night. There's a certain, their stuff was really, believe it or not, they had a better chart year in 1966 than the Beatles. They had more top 10 hits. And so they were the hottest band, the American band of 1966, if you go by the charts. Amazingly enough.
It was all downhill after that year, though. For them.
Well, yeah, of course it was. I mean, yeah, they peaked all at once. They were usually masters of acoustic strumming, and they had a certain jolly innocence. And like I said, they changed it up here, and they really went into the fun house with how they arranged this song. And
very Beach Boys influenced.
Yeah, very, very Beach Boys influenced. And it really kind of I guess it gives a good preview to the full-blown flower power outbreak that brought us the Summer of Love the next year. Yeah. I think it's a good preview of the kind of stuff we got in 67.
Right. Yeah. All right. So the next one, this is one of my all-time favorite songs. Yeah. What is it, Chris? Donovan Sunshine Superman.
Yeah, Donovan Sunshine Superman, which wonderfully sublimely ridiculous. Like I said, wonderful melody. It's got the instrumentation with the harpsichord, kind of mixing and matching like that opening with the harpsichord underneath that sort of that weird wild guitar lick, with this kind of like warbling guitar lick that comes out of nowhere. And then from there, it's just this little kind of almost tap dancing folk ditty. I mean, you can just see. I just picture Donovan Leitch sitting on like a pile of rubble, just with a big goofy smile on his face, holding a flower in one hand, or having a flower in his ear, and just kind of just sort of.
Well, that's basically what he was.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, but he just gets like truly ridiculous. I mean, he's a Scotsman, and so he sounds Scottish, and he croons earnestly and nonsensically on this song. Pretty much the lyric of 1966, quote, "Superman or Green Lantern ain't got a nothing on me. I can make like a turtle and dive for your pearls in the sea, yeah. And you can just sit there thinking on your velvet throne about all the rainbows that you can have for your own. When you've made up your mind forever to be mine, I'll pick up your hand and slowly blow your little mind." That's some creepy shit.
Yeah, well, I mean, if someone were to ask a question, what did the 1960s sound like? They sounded like this song.
Yeah, pretty much. Both sides of it. There's the folk rock revolution of the early half, and then
Yeah.
the way too much drugs second half. And so this is the perfect embodiment of both. Any other thoughts on this, Arturo?
I just gave you my thoughts, man. It's the sound of the 60s.
Yeah,
Time magazine presents their box. Remember those in the 1990s? We
yeah,
had those TV infomercials.
yeah,
Time magazine presents the 1960s. It would be like a 4 CD box set of all
yeah.
these songs. This
Uh-huh.
song would be on there.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, that and probably Atlantis too, which is
Yeah, the other one. Yeah.
which is just as lysergic. Not as good, but just as lysergic. Speaking
Yeah.
of which,
Speaking of drugs.
yeah, we move on. The Butterfield Blues Band's East West. It's less well known than the previous three songs, all of which were huge hits, but it's definitely just as adventurous, in which the most reverent of blues rock bands turns on the jazz fusion switch.
Yeah.
Paul Butterfield, for those of who don't know, Paul Butterfield was an American blues harp player, renowned for testing the boundaries of the blues with rock and jazz influences. I mean, most of his stuff, like I said, he was a great coverer of the Mississippi guys, like kind of ramp him up. He was a Californian, I believe, he's from the Bay, and he would sort of like just ramped up traditional blues. But here on East West, we find him and his bandmates at their most mystical. It is a mighty 13-minute long jam that owes as much to Middle Eastern folk and Latin jazz as it does to Muddy Waters or Willie Dixon. The song is permeated by nasty guitar and harmonica solos spread out like mescaline-tinged butter over a lovely bed of gentle bass grooves augmented by electric piano. This was an instrumental to be whacked out of your mind to at a happening party, man. It's worth noting. It's definitely worth noting that this effort predates both the Grateful Dead and Santana's similarly whacked out explorations by a couple of years, making it somewhat revolutionary. Wouldn't you agree, Arturo?
Yeah. And Paul Butterfield played lead guitar on Tombstone Blues from Bob Dylan's Highway 61 album.
That I did not know. I knew that he had a couple other guys on that, but Butterfield he's a really talented guy, man. He lived the rock and roll. I mean, he died of a drug overdose in his mid-40s, in the 70s, or in the 80s, I believe. But he lived it and he sounded it, and this is as trippy as it got. Right. Although the next song was even trippier than that. We're talking about the Dovers, the Third Eye.
Right.
This song effectively was sock hop for druggies.
Yeah.
And it was garage rock of the highest order. These guys were from Santa Barbara, California. Mm-hmm. And they took a simple, danceable, groovy groove and bashed the hell out of it. It's kind of like it's almost like Link Ray surf rock, like done by guys who couldn't play. In some strange ways. And then it has the wonderfully let's say transcendental LSD lyric, unlocked by the key, and now I am free. Whoa, dude.
Yeah.
I don't think that key was associated with a wooden door. Strange but true, the band's original name was the Vandells, not to be confused with the Vandellas. I assure you there was no Martha dancing in the streets in this group's efforts. Arturo?
Dancing in the streets on acid.
I was gonna say, bashed out groovy groove, baby, bashed out groovy groove. That's funny. Next, speaking of groovy grooves and acid, the Seeds, Trip Maker, subtle, real subtle. Another fine garage band from Southern California.
This was a year all these bands were getting away from their overt drug references in their songs. By the way, in '66, they really were.
Yeah, they were starting to, but they but some of them still made the cut. You know what I mean? And so here's a man. This is really an ode to the man of the hour in 1966, the chemist who was serving up the liquid love, or in the words of the Seeds frontman Sky Saxon, the dude who was, quote, taking orange, green, and white crystallized powders, mixing in the colors of colorized vials. And so what you really get,
He's basically describing the drug dealer who's giving acid to people.
Yeah, I was gonna say he's outing his dealer. That's not cool, man. He's getting his homeboy arrested. But so what you really have, so there's fuzzy bass, there's groove spiked electric piano, and there's this wild razor wire guitar soloing. It's more musical than the Dovers, but it's messier in terms of how it was played. Here was an unhinged anthem for unhinged times. Arturo, any thoughts?
I like this song more than the Third Eye, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
this song kind of rocks in its own way. It really does.
Yeah, no, it does. It's unhinged. I mean, and that's the best thing about it.
Yeah. My kind of acid-soaked punk. Speaking of acid-soaked punk.
Yeah, speaking of acid-soaked punk, it doesn't get any how do you outdo a song called Trip Maker? By doing a song called Psychotic Reaction. This is from a band called The Count Five. They were a Bay Area. They're from San Jose. This was chug-a-lug blues-inspired bass lines with swirling harmonica in the crevices of the mix, with runaway guitar solos. That was and everything was whacked out, as the song title suggests. This was bluesier than Butterfield and more unhinged than even the Seeds. Yeah. This was presented as a disturbing musical rendition of lunatic agony over romantic rejection. Amazingly, this messy affair actually peaked at number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100 in October of 1966. This has to be like one of the craziest, if not the single craziest, top 10 hit of all time.
It is. It's I didn't until we did this episode. I never knew, because this song was on the Nuggets box set.
Yep.
And I thought it was just one of many other, obscure mid-60s garage rock songs. Nope. Major hit. Major hit.
Yeah, major hit. Well, yeah. Major hits turned into major hit. Yeah, I'll tell you, major hits of much acid. Yeah. This is how this guy dealt with getting dumped. Oh, what a loser. Next song, The Yardbirds Turn into Earth. The band that introduced the world to guitarists Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and Jimmy Page go decidedly on blues guitar here on this lovely slice of headphone skullfuckery.
Yeah.
The simple drum beat and haunting vocal moans dominate the right ear. Meanwhile, Keith Relf's earnest lead vocal massages the left ear. This sounds like a gay romp through the elven forests, but is actually a recounting of depression as the world Relf once knew drifts away. This is quite something. It's for them, I don't think that either Beck or Page plays on this song, and if they do,
Beck
not
does.
Quite there.
I think. Yeah,
but the guitar is not up front and center. It's maybe mixed in there, but this was about as much of a curveball as you got from the Yardbirds.
Yeah, I mean, but Jeff Beck during this time was kind of like the musical direction leader of the Yardbirds at this time. Jimmy Page would join the band shortly afterward, but I mean, when we talk about the Yardbirds, I mean, Clapton became superstar. Page became superstar with Led Zeppelin. Jeff Beck was like the third guy of the Yardbirds, a hierarchy of guitarists. And what gets forgotten is how much of an experimentalist he was.
Yeah,
he was nowhere near as formal and as traditional as Clapton. And Page was an experimentalist, as we would see with Led Zeppelin, but Page always seemed to be grounded a little bit, no matter how far off he went into his stylistic adventures with Led Zeppelin. Jeff Beck was always the one, and you can hear it in his Yardbirds ears. He would truly go off the rails, and he had no problem like not being, not having the guitar front and center. That wasn't he didn't have that kind of an ego, which is really interesting for a guy who's supposedly a virtuoso guitar player.
Yeah, and it's not a coincidence that Nigel Tufnell from Spinal Tap is based on Jeff Beck. Because Jeff Beck may have approached Stonehenge if he was allowed to, for sure. So yeah, interesting stuff. And again, listening to it on headphones as an experience is actually kind of annoying. It's like evenly split between the main vocals stay on the right, and the backup vocals and the vocal stylings that are in the grooves stay on the
Dude, that's
right.
mono. That's mono recording. That's what it was like back then.
Yeah, it's pretty. Yeah, it's like, yep, it is mono recording. So
Yeah.
anyway, and then one final song to mention, the Standells' "Dirty Water," which was just a straightforward garage blues ditty about the Charles River and their love for their native Boston, Massachusetts. They loved that dirty water. I suppose there's probably an acid reference in there somewhere. They did love that dirty water. Now, I bring this up because back then it was a modest hit. I think it was like in the 25 or something like that on the Billboard charts back then. But it somehow became an anthem that accompanied the championship rise of the Boston Red Sox almost 20 years ago. So kind of a strange psychedelic song to be associated with a baseball team full of macho dorks. So
yeah, it's a song that never really did it for me that much. Yeah, I agree. It should be listed in 1966 garage rock songs, but I always thought it was kind of a corny guitar riff,
Yeah. Oh, I know. Dun 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 dun. Dun. Yeah, I was gonna say it sounds like it came off a TV show. I understand that, but it's a neat little song. It's a neat little ditty, and definitely worth a mention. So there you go.
Anyway, so now we're coming out of the heavens and we're coming down to earth at the end of 1966, and we got to give a mention to some earthy music, and earthy music coming in the form of some of the all-time great classic singles that came from both the Motown in Detroit and the Stax in Memphis record labels that were just pioneering record labels, providing us, basically they were the foundational Black American music labels of R&B and soul of the 1960s.
Yeah, obviously without Motown and Stax, we don't get black music as we know it. They really just sort of drove that along with Chess and King. They were sort of the most important of the black labels. Let's not commit an egregious oversight as we approach the end of this episode. Black musicians had an awesome 1966 too.
Yeah,
it wasn't just a white phenomenon. We spoke quite a bit about Motown in the Second Golden Age of Rock series' episode on 1964. And about how founder Berry Gordy established the scrappy Detroit label in the late 50s and built it into an unstoppable assembly line of hit songwriting and hit songmaking. The label's output of chart toppers was awesome for years, but the brilliance perhaps reached its peak in 1966. Check this out. The Temptations' Get Ready. The Temptations' Ain't Too Proud to Beg. The Spinners' Truly Yours. Stevie Wonder's Nothing's Too Good for My Baby, and also a Stevie Wonder cover of Blowing in the Wind, which is pretty wild. Jimmy Ruffin's What Becomes of the Broken Hearted, one of the great soul ballads of all time. The Supremes, You Cannot Hurt You Up. It's not cannot, You Can't Hurry Love. Which is an amazing song. You Can't
Hurry Love. Yeah.
And it was a #1 song that year. Marvin Gaye's Little Darling, I Need You, which is a tremendous song. The Four Tops, Reach Out, I'll Be There, which is also a #1 song that year. And then the Supremes, the other #1 song from that year, You Keep Me Hanging On, which is about as dramatic a song as it gets. The Four Tops, Standing in the Shadows of Love. And the Temptations' Beauty is Only Skin Deep.
Yeah, great song.
Yeah, that's a heck of a roll call right there. Now, that is a pop heaven and a pop nirvana. Hell, that is a pop wet dream of epic proportions. Gordy's machine was at its most well-oiled here. The songwriting's depth and scope was never better than it was in 1966. They had, for what it's worth, they had more hits in 64, but the output here is just better. I mean, this is just majesty personified. Even the minor output actually is pretty amazing. There's a series of Motown singles collections that tracks each year of the 60s, and so check out volume 6 of that. You can find that on the on all the streaming sites and on YouTube. So from that, check out the Isley Brothers version of "I Hear a Symphony," which was made famous by the Supremes. Ronald Isley and his brothers take what in the Supremes' hand was a bubblegum pop tune, and they turn it into operatic, heart-aching soul. In the sort of that Isley Brothers style, like, man, they got the balls of the soul of that song.
Right.
So anyway, that was the established Kings year. Now let's talk about Stax and sister label Volt, which broke out into the big time in '66. Stax and, like I said, its sister label Volt effectively put Memphis R&B on the map with its nasty blend of blues and balladry, embodied most especially by house band Booker T and the MGs and Otis Redding, undoubtedly one of the greatest singers who ever lived. After several years of regional success, defined by singles, mostly from singles by Rufus Thomas on Stax and by Otis Redding on Volt, the label struck a distribution deal with Atlantic Records late in 1965, setting up a truly magnificent 1966 of output and prominence. Now, the Stax Volt rise coincided with the rising influence of a young Isaac Hayes on the label's songwriting and scorching yet tuneful musical style. Yeah. The Atlantic connection was also fruitful in that it matched Stax's genius guitarist and songwriter Steve Cropper with Atlantic's wildly talented singer Wilson Pickett, which generated hits such as "In the Midnight Hour," which is an amazing song.
He also that year, Wilson also had Mustang Sally, came out that year, and Land of a Thousand Dances that same year. Na 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 na.
Yep, that same year. Yeah. Additionally, '66 also found Stax pumping out Eddie Floyd's "Knock on Wood," which features a famous and instantly recognizable opening horn riff. Bah, bah, bah.
Right.
So that song became a #1 R&B hit that year and reached number 28 on the pop charts. And Redding himself scored a major hit with the terrific ballad "Try a Little Tenderness."
Right.
And so that's some damn good stuff right there. So now,
and there's one other Atlantic artist who had probably the biggest hit, one if not the biggest hit out of them all.
And who's that?
Percy Sledge.
Oh,
When
yes.
A Man Loves a Woman.
Yes. Yes. Somehow I overlooked Percy Sledge. Thank you, fact checking, cuz. So now the Stax Volt phenomenon peaked 2 years later in 1968.
Right.
And Otis Redding's posthumous single "Sitting on the Dock of the Bay" reached the top of the Billboard charts, ranking as the number 4 overall single of that year. Unfortunately, tensions and ongoing contractual disputes between the leadership of Atlantic and Stax led to a dissolution of that relationship, the distribution relationship in 1968, which left Stax to sort of duke it out as an independent label. For a couple years, that worked. It was a time that made stars out of Isaac Hayes with "Hot Buttered Soul" in 1969, and then also the Staples Singers, who were a gospel act that made the crossover into mainstream pop. And there were several others as well. Yet by 1975, Stax was broke and declared bankruptcy, ending its run. Even so, we will always have 1966, when the influences of Redding, Hayes, Cropper, Duck Dunn, and others became part of the DNA of everything Black and R&B that followed. The influence was immeasurable. Arturo?
Yeah, no, definitely. One thing also about 1966 in R&B and soul in general, not just Motown and Stax, but I mean they were the majority of it really, and Atlantic, who are associated with Stax. But like when we think of R&B and soul, we think of the pervasive influence of funk, and then later, much later in this case, hip hop. So it's interesting to hear pre-1967 and basically pre-James Brown, pre Cold Sweat R&B soul music, and how different it is to what R&B sounds like now.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a very different beast. It's almost a different complete genre of music. What constitutes R&B now is not really rhythm and blues. It's something completely different, even though it's taken the R&B moniker. Much like how indie rock, there's nothing independent label about indie rock now, and there's nothing rock about most of it.
That's true. I mean, and if you look at it, I mean, a lot of the melodies and a lot of the singing styles that permeated this R&B, especially this year, goes back to the church. It goes back
Gospel,
to the
yeah.
it goes back to the hills of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama. I mean, it
Yeah.
goes it goes back to country western. Hell, it goes back to the pop standards of the
Sure.
30s and 40s. I mean,
Sure.
it's a really rich history, and at this
Yeah.
point, you still had boogie woogie influences, and it was more like soul is basically like, let's take like let's like white bubblegum pop and let's black the hell out of it.
Yeah.
Is really what's going on, and that's really the legacy of Stax Volt is more than Motown. Motown had its own kind of style, and they had the Smokey Robinsons and the Whitfields, but down there they really brought out the drama.
Yeah. Well, they were
Yeah.
grittier. Their brand of soul was grittier than Motown. So it
Yeah,
was more Southern fried, you know?
yeah, it was grittier, but it was even more soulful. It went down into the bowels
Yeah.
of your emotions and
Yeah.
what you were experiencing. And so,
Right.
yeah, they really achieved quite a lot. And so, yeah, Stax, we owe a great deal to, for sure. As we do at the end of these episodes, we encourage everyone to join the Facebook Curmudgeonly community. We have a page and we have a site up there on Facebook where we engage in lively discussions. These days, the dominant thread is Arturo's lists by year of the greatest studio albums. I believe 1993 is coming down the pike here pretty soon.
Yeah, it's coming down maybe next week or so. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. But anyway, join us there at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also, if you have anything to say, if you have a similar enthusiasm for the triad of albums that we spoke about earlier in this record, hit us up at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. We have a presence on Twitter or X or whatever the hell Elon Musk wants to call it, or whichever bad guys he wants to invite to use it next. And then, yeah, we dabble in Spotify, and we'll probably make a playlist here because this is a year that deserves it. So